Hello, good afternoon. On behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all of us at the Hutchins Center, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual space today at kind of an unusual time for us for Peter Mitchell's Du Bois Virtual Lecture. I'm Abby Wolf, and I have the pleasure of being the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center. One brief housekeeping item, please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep them brief so that we can incorporate as many of them as possible, and questions may be edited for clarity and length during the Q&A. Right now, it's my pleasure to say a few words about Suzanne Preston Blier, a good friend of the Hutchins Center, who will introduce Professor Mitchell's lecture today. Suzanne Preston Blier is Alan Whitehill Close Professor of Fine Arts and of African and African American Studies. I realized I didn't turn off all of my messages, so you're hearing beeps. I'm sorry about that. So anyway, back to Suzanne. Suzanne Blier is also a member of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard. Her most recent book projects include the forthcoming 1325, How Medieval Africa Made the World Modern, to be published by Yale next year, and Picasso's Demoiselles, The True Origins of a Modern Art Masterpiece, published in 2019 by Duke University Press. This last book was selected for the 2019 Wall Street Journal Arts Book Holiday List and was a finalist for the 2020 Prose Prize in Art History and Criticism. Her 2015 book, Art and Risk in Ancient Yoruba, Ife History, Power and Identity, around circa 1300, also won the Prose Prize in Art History and Criticism. In short, she's the author of numerous books and the winner of multiple prizes, and I can't name them all here, though I would love to. In 2017, she was bestowed a Yoruba Nigeria chieftaincy title, Otunyeye Obalufon, first translated as First Right Mother of Obulufon by Oba Adereme Adedapo, Secretary General of the Yoruba Council of Yoruba Obas, for her work on Ife art and history. She currently serves on the board of the National Committee for the History of Art and was president of the CAA, the Professional Association of Art Historians, Artists, and Designers, from 2016 to 2018. She has served in leadership roles in multiple associations and has had major fellowships in the arts and humanities, again, too numerous to list here. She is co-chair of an electronic geospatial base, Africa Map, which is a site expanding into World Map. And additionally, and very importantly to us at the Hutchins Center, she's the co-editor, along with Professor Gates and David Bindman, of the Image of the Black in African and Asian Art, and she has served as both a curator and a longtime and valued advisor to our Cooper Gallery of African and African American Art. Please join me in welcoming Suzanne Preston Blier to the W.E.B. Du Bois Virtual Lecture Series this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Skip, and welcome, Peter. It's my distinct honor to introduce you today. You'll be talking about the archaeology of Africa's islands, colonizing and being colonized. Professor Mitchell earned his BA from the University of Cambridge and his PhD from Oxford University, where since 2006, he has been professor of African archaeology. He's also an honorary research fellow in the School of Geography, Archaeology, and Environmental Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. His interests, his numerous publications, and his cross-cutting and deeply influential work on Africa and its origins, archaeology of hunter-gatherers, archaeological collections, fauna, flora, and animals, have been incredibly important from a wide variety of vantages. His 2005 book, African Connections, Archaeological Perspectives on Africa and the Wider World, explores the exodus of early modern humans into the African diasporas and speaks to the larger issues around the complex relationship between Africa and the outside world, in part a legacy of this, of which you'll be talking about today. In 2002, he published Archaeology of Southern Africa, again, crossing between a myriad of different sites, contexts, and ways of engagement. Since 2009, he's been co-editor of the journal Azania, which focuses largely on archaeological research in Southern and Eastern Africa, but also Africa as a whole. And he's got a myriad of volumes in which he's been working with others in bringing out anthologies which have presented cutting edge research on a wide variety of historical African.
Hey, Marielle?
Can you hear me still?
Mm-hmm.
Great. That speak to, among these, his 2006 edited Peoples and Cultures of Africa, a 6-volume work. In 2013, he co-edited with Paul Lane, the Oxford History of African Archaeology. In 2009, with B.W. Smith, the Eland's People, focusing on rock art of the Drakensberg Bushmen. In 2008, with L.S. Barham, a volume on the first Africans and African archaeology, from the earliest toolmakers to the most recent foragers. And in 2003, Researching Africa's Past, focused on British archaeology in Africa with Anne Haar and J.H. Hobart. His articles are broad, and I speak in some ways to some of the issues he'll be addressing today, from settling Madagascar and issues of colonization there, to the rich work he has done on rock paintings in Southern Africa and the Drakensberg area in particular, issues of the environment, of paleoclimates, et cetera, and various questions involving animals, whether it's ostriches and eggshell production, to disease and domestic animals, from cows to donkeys, to any number of ways in which humans and the natural world have intersected. With this in mind, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Peter Mitchell will be speaking to us about the archaeology of Africa's islands, colonizing and being colonized.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Bleer, and also Professor Gates and Dr. Wolf for the opportunity to give this afternoon's lecture. I'm only sorry that because of present circumstances, we're having to do all of this online rather than being able to do it face-to-face in Harvard and with a full body of students present. Hopefully those days will come back fairly soon. My starting point this afternoon is the claim that Africa has not featured as prominently in island archaeology as it should. This is despite the fact that the continent is surrounded by water on two sides, the Atlantic in the west, the Indian in the east, both with important bodies of islands in them, both with important histories of seafaring and maritime contact. The islands that I've circled here, from Macronesia in the northwest to the Gulf of Guinea to St. Helena, and then on the eastern side, Seychelles, Madagascar, Mauritius, the Comores, and so on. These islands participated in wider ocean histories, and that fact is very widely recognized. So too is the recognition that it makes sense to try and study them comparatively. I think, for example, of John Thornton's groundbreaking work on the history of the Black Atlantic, or more specifically, studies like those of Gerhard Seibert comparing Creole communities on Sao Tome and Cape Verde, or that of Felipe Ribeiro da Silva on the island forts of Arguin and Gaure. These examples begin to show us how enormously varied Africa's islands are. They differ not just in size and location and distance from the African mainland, but also, and crucially, of course, in their history. From Madagascar's quasi-continental dimensions and relatively long human history to the tiny speck and much shorter occupation record that is somewhere like Annobon in the Gulf of Guinea, from the land bridge islands of Bioko and Unguja to the oceanic remoteness of somewhere like St. Helena. And given all of this diversity, one might think that their archaeological record should also have been studied on a comparative basis, just like their history. And yet, Africa's islands still languish outside the mainstream of island archaeology research. They still rarely appear in journals and conferences and general debates. There are several reasons for this, of course, not just the fact that Africa happens to have fewer islands than the Pacific or the Mediterranean. The low profile stems also from the very real economic and environmental challenges that African governments face that restrict the amount of archaeological work they're able to support. It stems from the fact that in many, many cases, islands find themselves economically and politically marginalized as part of larger nation states, or are in some cases still outposts of European countries. But perhaps above all, it still stems from the continuing tendency to neglect Africa's past in archaeological narratives that remain rooted too often in the priorities and privileges of the global north. Studying the archaeology of Africa's islands, I would contend, therefore, should offer us exciting opportunities to challenge this situation, while also contributing to questions of broad interdisciplinary interest within the field of island archaeology and within the field of island studies as a whole. And some of those potential research themes are listed up here. Without falling into the outmoded trap of assuming that islands constitute isolated laboratories of cultural change, their relative discreteness and liminality nevertheless makes them an ideal opportunity for addressing a wide range of topics, including those that I've put down here. They have big questions to ask, questions that take advantage of their ability to illustrate for us something of the mechanisms by which the constituent parts of the world have functioned and have related to each other. Now, relevant to many of these themes on this particular slide is the fact that over the course of the past 500 or 600 years, all of Africa's islands were at one time or another colonized by non-African powers: Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Britain, Oman. In some cases, for example, Mauritius or Sao Tome and Principe, colonization by those powers meant literally that, the de novo settlement of previously uninhabited land, settlement that frequently resulted in catastrophic impacts on fragile island ecologies. The fate of the dodo up here at the right was all too widely replicated for other endemic plants and animals wherever Europeans set foot on pristine ground. This is one meaning of colonization, and it can be researched as readily in the African Atlantic as in the African or Western sector of the Indian Ocean. And it feeds directly into one of island archaeology's key concerns: how do humans impact on and transform island environments? Only archaeology and its paleo-environmental sister disciplines can provide us with information on the situation that existed before people arrived somewhere, or fill in the gaps left by surviving documentary records. Only thus are we going to be able to take informed decisions about how to address biodiversity loss or ecosystem conservation and restoration. But what I want to focus on this afternoon is the other implications of the term colonizing, the implications that flow from the fact that it was non-African actors who gained control of African islands. As part of the emergence of the modern, globalized, international, capitalist world system described archaeologically by Charles Orser, among many others, the contacts and commercial relations with colonizing states and trading companies that this involved set in motion that provide fertile ground for comparisons with the archaeologies of other parts of the world, both within Africa and across its diaspora, particularly in the Americas. So what then were some of the consequences that European and Omani colonization entailed? Among others, they include the processes illustrated on this slide. The development of plantation-based economies aimed at large-scale production of cash crops intended for an increasingly globalized market, sugar in the first instance, but also coffee, cacao, cloves. The recruitment of slaves to work in those plantations, and following emancipation in the 19th century, of indentured laborers to replace the enslaved. The creation of new creolized populations that drew upon multiple cultural, linguistic, and genetic inheritances from mainland Africa, Europe, and Asia, while all the while working out new forms of practice and belief and social organization unique to their island homes. The innovation of strategies of resistance against enslavement, including the emergence in some cases of distinctly maroon communities, similar to those better known archaeologically from places like Jamaica and Brazil. And finally, the incorporation into global economic and political networks that subjected and still frequently subject Africa's islands to external interests, notwithstanding the fact that most became part of independent nation states in the 1960s and 1970s. And the picture at bottom left expresses that particular point rather neatly, I think. Collectively, therefore, it's these processes that constitute my theme, colonizing and being colonized, or perhaps put more clearly, colonizing and resisting. I want to begin on the western side of Africa, its Atlantic side, because it was there in the archipelagos of Macronesia that 15th century Europeans first trialed the new navigational techniques and strategies of colonization that took them around the continent's periphery and across the ocean into the Americas, Asia, and the Pacific. Macronesia might perhaps be an unfamiliar term, but it's used by biologists to refer to those North African islands, North Atlantic African islands close to the continent, among them Madeira, Cape Verde, and the Canary Islands. Madeira and Cape Verde were not inhabited at the time of European discovery, so only in the Canaries did Europeans encounter and then subjugate an indigenous population. The strategies that they pioneered to do this constituted a trial run for the New World, making them of interest to historians and archaeologists on both sides of the Atlantic. The superiority of steel weapons over those of stone, the impact of epidemic disease on populations that had no resistance to new pathogens, the playing off of one indigenous group against another, employing allies where necessary and getting rid of them as soon as they ceased to be useful, the ability to move men and material rapidly from place to place using ships and horses, a ruthlessness and sense of destiny that led Europeans to operate by wholly different and often incomprehensible rules to those followed by Aboriginal groups. As several scholars have pointed out, and as a caption at the left here, the top left here makes plain, these factors were as evident in Castile's takeover of the Canary Islands as they were in its takeover of Mexico. And in both places, we then see profound ecological transformations taking hold as new forms of land use were instituted, new species of plant and animal introduced that collectively undercut and destroyed the possibilities for indigenous groups to survive independently of or unaffected by colonial rule. Archaeology can show us these processes in many ways, most graphically perhaps at top left, in the multiple sword wounds on the upper body of this man from Los Acarreaderos on Gran Canaria that were probably inflicted by a Spaniard mounted on horseback. But there's also evidence for a whole series of other things. The remodeling of pre-colonial domestic architecture and the use of space to include internal rather than external fireplaces, indigenous adoption of ceramics, metal, and glassware at sites like Cueva Pintada, the construction of the first sugar refineries and sugar plantations at places like Las Canarias at bottom left, the survival into the 20th century of a handmade tradition of making pottery that was exported widely to the Americas that drew both upon native Canarian but also African ways of making ceramics, the introduction of powerful new animals, cattle, horses, donkeys, even camels, and the extinction of smaller endemic species like the lava mouse and the lava shearwater, both of which fell victim to the black rats introduced by Europeans to the island of Fuerteventura. And then we have genetic studies, which add one further perspective to all of this. Today's Canary Islanders show a massively greater maternal rather than paternal inheritance from their pre-invasion ancestors. Testimony to a heavily sex-biased pattern of violence and intermarriage, which is a term that is perhaps to be used rather loosely in the context. They derive just 7% of their Y chromosome ancestry from indigenous populations, but as much as 1/3 of their mitochondrial DNA, which is mediated through the female line. Now, compared to the Canaries, archaeology in Madeira and Cape Verde is much less developed. But there too, European settlement, in this case by the Portuguese, wrought significant ecological change on fragile island ecologies and introduced large numbers of involuntary settlers from Africa to work on plantations in a cycle of land exhaustion, environmental damage, and changing labor practices that then spread outward with European expansion across and beyond the Atlantic. Madeira in particular suffered from what historian Jason Moore has described as a profound rupture in its environmental history, as the largely forested landscape that the island had at European discovery and which gave it its name was transformed in little more than a century into a heavily de-wooded, cultivated landscape that made it the largest sugar producer of the early 16th century. To illustrate that, consider just one fact. By the early 1500s, land clearance for agriculture to grow sugar and for fuel was removing trees at the rate of 7 square kilometers a year on an island that is only 100 times that size. This parable of unsustainable devil-may-care resource extraction, which resonates strongly with us today, depended heavily upon enslaved labor. But when sugar collapsed in the mid-1520s to be replaced by wine, the demand for cheap labor also fell away because growing grapes needed far fewer unskilled workers. Numbering roughly 3/4 of Madeira's population in the 1520s, by the end of the 16th century, African slaves made up perhaps only 5% of the island's inhabitants, creating a demographic profile quite different from that of the other Portuguese colonies. And yet, despite Madeira's historical preeminence in the development of the Atlantic sugar-based economies, its archaeology so far remains focused on already known urban, military, and religious sites, and on recovering artifacts and evidence of diet that tend to confirm, rather than to challenge or to go beyond, what we already know from historical sources. The opportunity to do more than this is evident from the work that Chris Evans and Mary Louise Sørensen from Cambridge conducted some years ago in Cape Verde. But even there, because of the nature of the agenda to which they had to work, most of what they achieved focused on the monumental, on built heritage that was something that could resonate with the development of tourism opportunities rather than on the quotidian. As Cape Verdean archaeologist Sandra Miranda has observed, still today, relatively nothing has been done to explore the archaeologies of slavery, of rural rather than urban life, of vernacular architecture, or of the ways in which people produced basic commodities for trade like sugar and cotton and salt. Cape Verde does, however, exemplify another aspect of island archaeology, namely the exploration of shipwrecks. On the positive side, this has involved identifying and excavating several wrecks, notably a late 17th century Portuguese wreck off the island of Sal in the top right of the map, and that of the East Indiaman Hartwell, which was wrecked on the neighboring island of Boa Vista in 1787 on its maiden voyage from Britain to China. The study of the Sal shipwreck by Mario Varela Gomez and colleagues has been particularly informative. For example, the many hundred glass beads and copper bracelets that you see at the bottom are precisely the kinds of objects that Europeans used as exchange items when trading on the West African coast, while the largely Portuguese ceramics from the wreck can be matched right across the Portuguese Empire, from Lisbon, where they were mostly made, to Brazil Angola, Macau, Gaure, and so on. Regrettably, however, most of the underwater archaeology that has taken place in Cape Verde has been motivated not by this kind of scientific curiosity, but by financial greed, with many finds auctioned for profit, few records kept locally, and little effort made to build an archaeological infrastructure locally. In short, the operations of companies like Afrima and Archaeonautus perfectly underline the difficulties confronted by many small island states, not only those in Africa, in securing and investigating their archaeological heritage. The global reach of the ceramics from the Sal Island wreck that I mentioned a moment ago underline the importance of islands within evolving networks of seaborne commerce and colonial expansion over the last few hundred years. As with St. Helena in the middle of the South Atlantic, this sometimes gave them a significance that went way beyond anything they could produce themselves. They became important simply because they were on the way to somewhere else. But as well as this, islands were also important as crucial nodes in the distribution and spread of new crops. This is very evident, for example, in Sao Tome and Principe in the Gulf of Guinea, which were colonized by the Portuguese at the end of the 1400s. After an initial couple of decades, when they were mostly of interest for exporting slaves to Portugal and to the coast of Ghana, where they could be exchanged for gold, and where the islands also served as a revictualling station for Portuguese ships moving further south in Africa or coming back up the Atlantic coast. The islands then experienced their own sugar boom later on in the 1500s, before eventually falling victim to Brazilian competition. But what they also did was they saw numerous experiments with other crops. Some, like the wheat and the olives that you see at the top of this slide, failed completely. Others, like oranges and lemons and sugarcane particularly, proved highly successful. But perhaps the most important of all were in fact the manioc or cassava and the maize at the bottom left that proved to be vitally important new carbohydrate staples introduced from the islands to the African mainland. In other words, Sao Tome and Principe, like Portuguese colonies on the other side of the continent, were key to the onward transmission into Africa of important elements of Alfred Crosby's well-known Columbian exchange, as well as pioneering the development of plantation-grown cacao and coffee crops in West Africa. It's thus all the more regrettable that today, almost certainly, Sao Tome and Principe are probably the only country in the world where no archaeological research of any kind has ever taken place. Some have claimed that slavery was America's original sin. If so, then that was a sin that also deeply stained many African islands. On the Atlantic seaboard of Africa, most archaeological investigations of the trade in enslaved people have focused on the mainland. One exception is Bunce Island in Sierra Leone, a major center for the Royal African Company, particularly for acquiring captives sent to what is now the southern United States, where, as Joanna Carney has shown, they were particularly valued because of their familiarity with rice cultivation by planters in what is now South Carolina. Krista Corse's investigations of the British fort on Bunce Island show some interesting departures from practice in other European forts on the West African coast, including provision of separate male and female quarters and open yards for exercise rather than confinement in cells. What they also show very clearly is that British presence was only feasible, it was only viable because of the provision of food and water and craft services by a nearby village of free African people. Something which is also very evident in the work of Ibrahimo Chao at Gaure in Senegal, a fortified island just off the modern Senegalese capital of Dakar. Here too, what emerges archaeologically and what emerges historically is how much the slave trade was a collaborative enterprise of both Europeans and Africans, perceptions of European dominance being at variance with a much more complicated reality on the ground. Rather more archaeological work has been done on the archaeologies of the slave trade and the enslaved in the Indian Ocean. And here islands not only consumed and supplied, but in the case of Madagascar, also actively procured people for that trade. On the French island of Réunion, for example, which the French colonized in 1665, several graves at the Marin cemetery on the west of the island are almost certainly those of enslaved Africans, based on the physical anthropology of the skeletons within them. In one case in particular, a young lady has artificially pointed incisors, a form of dental modification also known from Barbados and closer for most of you, I imagine, the African burial ground in New York. And the spatial segregation of those graves outside the area of the cemetery used by French settlers and their lack of superstructure confirm the low status held by those buried there within the wider colonial society. To take another example, before passing under British control in 1810, Mauritius was also French. There we go. Here, the occupants of the Le Morne cemetery, excavated by Krish Sito and others, were either slaves or perhaps more likely first generation emancipated Africans. Their excavations have recovered the remains of over 30 people, many of them interred with grave goods like tobacco pipes or buttons, pieces of pottery, and so on, in clear departure from standard Christian practice. Here too, ancient DNA analysis confirms the East African or Malagasy ancestry of these individuals. The bones of these people also show a high incidence of conditions like osteomyelitis, inflammatory conditions consistent with a very high level of manual work. Put together, in other words, what we can begin to gauge here is something of the actual detail of the lives of those whom Europeans enslaved, to restore them, in a sense, a little bit of the dignity of which they were robbed. As another example, consider the work of Andrew Pearson and colleagues in Rupert's Valley on St. Helena. Over 8,000 people are buried here. Some 300 or so have been studied archaeologically. They were brought here from slave ships intercepted by the Royal Navy, which used St. Helena as an offloading point between 1840 and 1867 for people liberated from ships taking individuals to the Americas. Most of those buried in Rupert's Valley seem to have been children and teenagers. The overwhelming majority of them are male, suggesting a clear preference of gender, of course, on the part of traders. Most don't have any grave goods, but what is interesting is that a few individuals stand out. So, for example, one person was buried with a necklace that contained an antelope horn that you see at bottom left. A few individuals have glass beads, some of them probably very highly valued because they showed considerable wear, or in some cases are definitely of 17th or 18th century manufacture and were therefore several generations old by the time at which they were buried. Most poignantly of all, perhaps, is the mattress of over 9,000 glass beads that was used to accompany the burial of a single stillborn infant. These instances are few, but what they show is that not everyone had their possessions confiscated when they were forced aboard ship, and that when freed and on St. Helena, African individuals were able to play a role in organizing the burials of their friends and relatives. Agency, and with it the possibilities of resistance, in other words, did not disappear on leaving Africa's shores. Now, for sure, the opportunities for retaining and expressing one's sense of identity were undoubtedly greater in the case of the indentured laborers of mostly Indian origin who were brought to Mauritius and also to Réunion and Seychelles as a replacement workforce after slavery's abolition in the 1800s. On the Trianon estate that you see at the top here, for example, in Mauritius, Diego Calon and colleagues see this change from slavery to indentured labor reflected architecturally in the development of a freer, more dispersed pattern of settlement linked by paths, by the establishment of single family accommodation within the stone barracks that were inherited from the era of slavery, and by the construction of totally new, if less substantial, private houses made from more perishable materials. And what we see here in the period of indenture contrasts strongly with a much more tightly organized use of space that was prevailing pre-emancipation, an organization of space that emphasized surveillance and control in ways that are familiar from the research of American scholars like James Dell and Teresa Singleton in the Caribbean. Similar things emerged from the recent work of Julia Young-Haynes at Brado, a second sugar plantation on Mauritius where Indian laborers were employed in the 19th century. And this, along with the work at Trianon and elsewhere, forms really the first instance of what we could call the archaeology of indenture. It clearly overlaps with aspects of colonial archaeology or plantation archaeology more generally. But archaeological investigations of the experience of indentured South Asian Indian laborers have not, in fact, previously been undertaken anywhere else, notwithstanding the fact that they were brought to over 20 countries, from Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana to Malaysia, from South Africa to Fiji. As Mauritian archaeologists have begun to point out, this gives their island, and by extension the Western Indian Ocean as a whole, the opportunity to begin defining the parameters of a new form of archaeological practice. And thinking beyond connections with South Asia, what it also does is to open up possibilities for comparing, using archaeology and texts and oral histories, the situations that indentured laborers from India found themselves on Western Indian Ocean islands, with the situation of indentured laborers from Cape Verde, Angola, and Mozambique, who in admittedly much more forced fashion formed much of the workforce on Sao Tome and Principe from the 1870s up until shortly before independence, 100 years later. Now, in all of this, there's still a widespread tendency, I think, in the West to think of plantation slavery as a peculiarly European or Euro-American vice. And in fact, archaeologically speaking, one of the most insightful studies of slavery on an African island comes from a very different context, from its practice under Omani rule in the 19th century of Pemba, an island that at the time formed part of the Sultanate of Zanzibar and that today forms part of Tanzania. As Sarah Croucher remarks, this makes for an unusual case study in the archaeology of slavery, one that has to be understood as much by reference to Swahili and Arabian and Islamic norms and practices as by comparison with how plantation economies operated elsewhere. Oman brought Zanzibar and the East African coast under its control during the 18th century, with many individuals from Arabia settling on Pemba and its sister island of Unguja. Omani merchants invested heavily in plantation agriculture, particularly for the cloves seen growing here at top right. And they brought slaves to the islands in large numbers to work those plantations for them. 10,000 people a year in the 1840s, producing a population of around 100,000 at emancipation in 1897, not to mention the many thousands more exported across the sea to Arabia. Croucher has noted that public understandings of slavery in Zanzibar draw heavily today on how plantations operated in the United States, but actual practice seems to have been different, with people accessing a multiplicity of potential statuses, the children of female slaves taken as concubines being treated as near equals to the offspring of freeborn wives, and male individuals having opportunities to raise their status via labor and the practice of Islam. Oral and textual histories also suggest that in many cases enslaved people ate and dressed like the free and could even be quite familiar with them, a form of integration that, rather ironically, may find material expression in the lack of any obvious distinctive body of material culture. Unlike, for example, the partly African-inspired colonial wares of North America and the Caribbean, 19th century pottery on Pemba shows absolutely no sign of mainland African influence, notwithstanding the mainland origins of the slave population working on these plantations, but was instead part of a centuries-old insular tradition that survives today. And that kind of integration extended to what was cooked in and eaten from that pottery. All plantation residents, Omani elites, enslaved Africans, the lot, used rice-suited ceramic forms and rice-based foodways. Although perhaps the degree of assimilation that this is pointing to may be equivocal. Did the enslaved really have a choice in what they were eating and how they were eating it? Or did they resist by opting to embrace prevailing coastal Islamic and Swahili norms and cultural practices as a way of enhancing their status? It's difficult perhaps to say. That owners armed and use their slaves sometimes in confrontation with each other certainly speaks to Pemba being different from much European practice, but we need to be careful not to understate the more brutal aspects of Zanzibari slavery, nor the more subtle means by which owners could exercise control. Plantations like Umgoli, which Croucher has excavated, for example, typically included a stone bench or baraza that you can see marked out in the bottom left-hand corner of the map of the plan. And on this stone bench in front of the main house, elite men and sometimes women would sit and socialize and chat, while all the time, however, giving orders to those working for them. And immediately in front of the baraza would be where people would be made to bring and sort and dry clothes. A clear distinction, in other words, between the social space of the free on the one side and the social space of the enslaved who are doing the work on the other. To move between those spaces, the space of the free and the space of the enslaved, was quite understandably the ambition of many slaves. Archaeologists thus also seek to contribute to understanding marronage, the escape of enslaved people from captivity, and their establishment of communities that might, if successful, retain autonomy from former owners. The more inaccessible parts of many African island interiors provide multiple opportunities of this kind, from Tenerife in the Canary Islands to Mauritius and Réunion in the Indian Ocean to Sao Tome in the Gulf of Guinea. Le Morne, which I mentioned earlier on in Mauritius, is well known, for example, in oral history and in colonial documentary sources for having been repeatedly inhabited by Maroons, sometimes in large enough numbers to form a recognizable community. And the rock shelters that exist on the very top of the Brabant Inselberg that you see in the top slides here likely record their presence in the form of fireplaces, crude stone walls, and limited faunal remains. As one might expect, however, written histories offer little real sense of the lives of those occupying these sites, since those histories were written, after all, by people who wanted to bring those lives to an end, or at least wanted to bring their freedom to an end. Thus, on Réunion, textually attested large camps have yet to be identified archaeologically, but probable evidence of marronage does exist. For example, high above the caldera of the island's largest volcano, the Piton des Neiges. Accessible today only by helicopter, as you can see, the aptly named Vallée Secrète, investigated by Anne-Laure Dijoux, contains two dry stone structures that you see at the bottom right, each of them with a fireplace, a few artifacts, and a fauna that comprises feral, possibly stolen livestock, and young, still flightless bird. This site is some 3,000 meters high. Winter temperatures here get down to freezing, and the predominant bird that is present, Barreau's petrel, is a seasonal visitor to the island, all of which makes one think that occupation of the Vallée Secrète was probably an episodic and seasonal activity before slavery's abolition in 1848. The Bantu and Malagasy origin of the names of local landscape features and the presence of numerous possibly translocated edible and medicinal plants reinforce the connections with fugitive Africans. On Mauritius and Réunion, marronage on Mauritius and Réunion, and the likelihood that slaves on Zanzibar deliberately strove to assimilate local foodways, ceramics, and religious practices show how despite appalling circumstances, people sought to retain their own sense of agency. Two islands that I have not yet mentioned show this still further. Abandoned by Portugal, which had taken their ancestors there in the mid-1500s, the population of Annobon, 150 kilometers to the south of Sao Tome and today part of Equatorial Guinea, eventually came to reject all efforts by Europeans to reassert control until the beginning of the 20th century, developing instead an egalitarian society that gave up cotton production in favor of subsistence farming, while trading fish and garden produce to occasional passing European ships for the metal and the alcohol that the islanders could not produce for themselves. Archaeologists have still to explore Annobon, but this is not true of Tromelin, a second small African island. Even smaller, in fact, because Tromelin is barely a square kilometer in size, located some 450 kilometers east of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. Here, a shipload of Malagasy slaves was abandoned after the boat carrying them to Mauritius was wrecked off the island in 1761. The French survivors built themselves a second boat and left, promising to come back, which of course they did not. The last survivors, 7 women and a baby, were rescued 15 years later, having consumed an estimated 90,000 sooty terns, the feathers of which they wove into clothing, as well as birds' eggs, fish, scarce plants, and the occasional turtle. Lacking alternatives, they took refuge from cyclones in thick-walled stone shelters that they built on the island's highest point, 6 meters above sea level, abandoning Malagasy social norms of how space should be organized, and abandoning the even more fundamental taboo that restricted the use of stone to the houses of the dead rather than the housing of the living. As recovered by Max Gaure and his colleagues, the lives built by the Utiel survivors direct our attention not only to the human drive to survive against the odds, but also to archaeology's capacity for delivering insights into what may go unremarked by historical sources. They also neatly link one of Africa's smallest islands to one of its largest. They speak to the ability of people to create new ways of living and being after arriving in new homes, whether by choice or not. They raise questions of the ecological impact that people's arrival on islands had. And they bring into focus the complex connections that people living on African islands had. In the case of Tromelin, to Madagascar, from where they had come, to Mauritius, which is where they had been destined to go, and where in fact they were eventually taken and allowed to remain free after their rescue, to France, the origin of those who had brought them there and then abandoned them. The themes that mark the lives of the people of Tromelin are all key issues in island studies. Like earlier chapters in the history of Africa's islands, chapters that we could call arriving, altering, and becoming. Colonizing and Resisting sets out a fruitful agenda for engaging in their comparative archaeological study, as well as showing how Africa can and should make a powerful and informative and informed contribution to island archaeology as a whole. Thank you very much indeed.
Hi there. For some reason, I'm unable to start my video. There we go. Thanks, Abby. Thank you so much for this incredibly rich, complex, and illuminating talk that I think brings to the core the larger issue of why islands matter so much. And in many respects, you had brought forward the term liminality at the outset, which is certainly germane here, but also in many of these examples, you can see how the liminal becomes the center around which so many of these arguments and our understanding of history can be both enriched and complicated in really fruitful ways. And I found myself listening to this wonderful presentation and jotting down potential questions that then you would come back to and answer sort of after I had formulated them, as happens in some really wonderfully rich talks. So I have really two larger questions. It's very hard to draw them apart because of the diversity and the complexity of what you were talking about. But one is a little bit earlier to this period, and I'm wondering, and you may not have engaged in it, so feel free to move beyond it, but I'm wondering about questions such as ocean currents and how that influx and indeed may have had an important impact on particularly the eastern, the islands off of the eastern coast of Africa in the period before scientific navigation, and the requirement that people who arrived stayed there for a certain period of time before moving back, and how that might have factored in, as well as currents on the west coast of Africa as well. But my larger question, in part because one of the threads that you are exploring through this complex needle has to do with comparative approaches to both island settlement and engagement around plantation and enslavement traditions, is to see if I could push you a little bit further to think about sort of a broader array of influences within this. On the one hand, we know that the British and the French and the Dutch are very different in their approaches to not only slavery, but life in general. And we could add to that the Portuguese as well. Just they inhabited a different sense of space and place. For example, in Ouida and other places that they inhabited, although these are not islands per se, they became kind of virtual islands within the context of settlement. And from that vantage point, and again, thinking about sugar, I was reminded of Cyprus and the early sugar plantations there, and the question of Muslim influence on this. A subject that you really hadn't addressed. And I think it would be interesting to explore, because that's a factor also in the in Madeira and the Canary Islands. And from that vantage point, to think about the possible differences and complexities around, on the one hand, the Amatzir or the Berber, who played such an instrumental role in some cases from sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa, Morocco, et cetera, and into Spain and Portugal. So we get Spain and Portugal that are also embracing key aspects of African references. And I'm thinking about the Canary Islands and questions of the terracottas, and whether, you know, the ways in which the Amatzir versus the Arabs, whether it's the Oman or other kinds of contexts, might also in some ways enrich and complicate and offer another dimension within this already incredibly rich, very thoughtful, and I think provocative lecture that you have given today.
Thank you very much. That's an enormously varied set of points. Let me see whether I can try and remember each of
I do that, and I apologize.
No, it's fine. I think very clearly the issue of ocean currents and wind systems and so on is a major contrast between the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean side of the continent, and that's evident in the fact that centuries and centuries before Europeans break into the scene in 1498, the Indian Ocean has a real deep-seated unity of commercial transactions, of the spread of Islam, more specifically in the African context, the creation of I guess what we could call a kind of Swahili world community, which is partly on the mainland, although often using islands on the shoreline there, and also extending into places like the Comores and the northern tip of Madagascar and so on. And you don't really have that at all on the Atlantic side. So clearly there's a very big difference there. I think with respect to thinking about sugar and the archaeology of sugar plantations, what you mentioned there about places like Cyprus, and you could move further west in the Mediterranean to Sicily and southern Italy and Iberia, of course, before the Spanish and Portuguese move out into the Atlantic. I'm not aware of very much archaeological work having been done on that, but I think that would be a very interesting set of comparative examples to look at to play off against what we see in the Atlantic, what we see in the Americas, and of course what we see in the Indian Ocean. And I think, yes, what you were suggesting there vis-a-vis the possibilities of a Muslim influence there in medieval or early modern times would also resonate perhaps with the work of Sarah Croucher on Pemba, and definitely be worth thinking of. I think with the Amazigh and the Canary Islands, that's a very interesting kind of worms to get into, because it relates directly to issues about the politics of the Canary Islands, the way in which people there have thought about themselves, whether they think of themselves as being Spanish, or whether they might seek independence or at least greater autonomy, both under fascism and since the restoration of democracy. Canarian archaeology is, to my mind as an outsider, very much taken up with this kind of issue, because on the one hand, you have people who are looking to the classical world, to Phoenicians and Carthaginians and Romans as the people responsible for discovering and settling the Canary archipelago, almost as a kind of late first millennium BC, beginning of the first millennium AD instance of colonization as Europeans later did it in the late Middle Ages. And on the other hand, you have people thinking, well, no, this is to write the history of the Canaries as if it's just some kind of appendix of what's going on in the Mediterranean. We need to be thinking much more about what actually goes on in the Canaries. We need to think about comparisons between the Canaries and the ancestral communities from which their population came on the African mainland. So as an outsider, I don't have a clear answer to that, but I'm struck by the great difficulty in coming to a consensus about this. And in terms of comparison, what also strikes me is the difficulty that still seems to exist about coming to a consensus about when people get to some other African islands, including Madagascar, which you mentioned in your introduction, totally different place, totally different oceanic context. But again, a debate which is not entirely archaeological, a debate which is certainly open to politicization, just as much as it needs to be informed by an understanding of those ocean currents and wind systems and so on that you talked about. So I guess what you were saying in your questions, and what I hope I was saying, is that it's good to think about islands, it's good to use islands to think with, and it's good to try and do this by thinking a little bit out of the boxes in which we often find ourselves trapped. And that's the fun part of doing this.
Thank you.
Peter, I thought your, Suzanne, great question. Peter, I thought your lecture was riveting. I was only sorry when you stopped.
Thank you.
Just really, I mean, it was a dazzling lecture. I've been to a few of those islands and thought about a few more. Most recently, to my own surprise, Gran Canaria. And the reason is because we trace the ancestry of Narciso Rodriguez. Do you know who he is?
I don't know.
He's a fashion designer, very familiar to Americans because he designed Michelle Obama's inauguration dress.
Okay.
And Carolyn Kennedy.
My daughter would probably know this.
Yes. and Carolyn Kennedy's wedding dress. Carolyn Kennedy was killed with John Kennedy in that terrible airplane accident. But he was from Cuba. And he knew vaguely that his ancestors were from the Canary Islands. Well, it turned out that using the paper trail, just a paper trail, we were able to go back to his 14th and 15th great grandfathers. Wow. And his 14th great grandfather was born in Spain around 1458 and arrived in the Canary Islands in 1478 as one of those first 900 foot soldiers sent by the crown to subdue the island. And he married a woman named Maria Gonzalez, who is Narciso's 14th great grandmother, who was not only an indigenous Canarian, but Maria's father was called Tenesor Samidan, aka Fernando Guaratina, and who was the last pre-Spanish king of Gran Canaria. So there you see a classic case of the two ruling families breeding together to create the third term, right? So my question really is about the DNA of the indigenous people. Now, for our purposes, when we were filming him, we just presumed that the indigenous people were from North Africa, right? Well, quote unquote, a Berber descent. Isn't that the case? Isn't that what we think through the DNA? Or am I wrong about that?
No. I think you're absolutely correct, and I think that the DNA work that I'm aware of that has been done using ancient DNA in the Canaries certainly points to that. I don't know that there's any ancient DNA work that would in any way substantiate claims of Phoenician or Carthaginian or Roman settlement.
No, that's total rubbish. That's the wishful thinking, right?
Well, if that's what you want to wish for, you know.
That's a good way to put
it. I think it's wishful thinking. The actual amount of archaeological evidence to substantiate Phoenician and Carthaginian presence is, I think, zero. Roman presence, there's a little bit, but there's a very little bit. And that doesn't explain why you get people who are clearly linguistically, ethnically, genetically, culturally of Northwest African origin. It doesn't explain why they would be occupying 7, 8 islands out in the Atlantic. It doesn't explain anything about their history subsequently. It's a dead end intellectually.
Yeah, thank you for that, because that's what we told him. I should have called you first. But I have 2 more questions, if I may. So what would Gran Canaria have looked like if we're transported back in time, say in 1650? What percent would have been sub-Saharan, what percent would have been North African, and what percent would have been Spanish, and what would the mixture have looked like?
Off the top of my head, I can't give you any numbers for that, but there definitely are archaeological sites that begin to speak to that. For example, there's an interesting cemetery from a place called Finca Clavijo, which is 16th century in date, I think, if I remember correctly. And there's been a lot of work done on it. So there's been ancient DNA work done. There are artifacts that are recovered with some of the burials. There's been stable isotope analysis work done on the skeletons to try and identify where they may be from. And one of the things that is interesting about this is that it's quite mixed. The people who are buried here are obviously not from the top echelons of Gran Canarian society. They are probably kind of ordinary working people. Whether that means any of them were enslaved is not something you're likely to be able to identify, of course, from that kind of archaeological analysis. But what's interesting is there are clearly people who are of indigenous descent. There are people who are of sub-Saharan descent. There are people of European descent. There are people who are being buried with Christian medallions. There are people who are being buried oriented towards Mecca. And what the excavators describe, and what makes sense to me, is that what you've got here is a community which is quite mixed in its origins, that is actually working out something new. It's working out what it is to be Canarian in this new situation where you have people from all these different places with these different kinds of traditions, these different inheritances, some of them with much more power than others. And whatever the rules are, and one imagines the rules are tending to insist upon an overt adherence to Catholicism, this is not necessarily what is actually being done at the end of the day. And so there's also this hint, perhaps, that you're getting a little bit of autonomy and agency and even resistance, perhaps, of the kind that one could see in the New World, but one can also begin to pick up on here and on Mauritius and elsewhere.
Right. What recent scholarship has shown the extent of practicing Muslims among the enslaved Africans from Senegambia, which is only logical because we know about the jihads. We know that when West Africa was converted, and we know that through the transatlantic slave trade database that 25% of our, meaning African-American, North American Africans, as it were, of our direct ancestors came from Senegambia. So they had to be Muslim.
Absolutely.
And my other question, and I'm sorry, I don't want to, Abby's going to kick me under the virtual table here for abusing my role as director. But my other question really goes back to one of your slides, one of your early slides, which was from Harper's, I think, from 1906, photographs of enslaved Africans. And I was just wanted to make sure I read that correctly and wondered where they were coming from.
Wait 1 second. They will be, just bear with me one moment. Yes. They will be what were euphemistically described as contract laborers, brought by the Portuguese to Sao Tome and Principe to grow cacao. And of course, yes, in theory they were paid, and in theory they were supposed to be able to go back to Angola or wherever they had come from afterwards. But in practice, they didn't. In practice, they were never remunerated properly. They were certainly never given the opportunity to leave. And their descendants are there to this day on the very same plantations. And to my mind, that's one of those many things that Sao Tome and Principe would be beautifully able to engage with archaeologically, in that you have people living in these plantations. And I've been to some where you would find today individuals who are the children and grandchildren, perhaps even of some of those people in that picture, and be able to develop a very interesting understanding of what life was like on those plantations, using oral history, using an understanding of the landscapes that people lived in, using the material culture that one can get at archaeologically, in a way that I think would be of interest to present day people in Sao Tome and Principe, would speak very much to wider archaeological understandings of indenture, as I said, but also of enslavement elsewhere. And given Sao Tome and Principe is not one of the world's richest countries, would also enhance the possibilities for community-based tourism, heritage tourism, which is something that the country desperately could benefit from.
Well, that photograph is basically yesterday. I mean, that was 114 years ago, which is extraordinary. I was shocked to see that. If you could do research, if the other Gates Foundation phone and said, Peter, what's the most urgent investment we can make, or in terms of furthering our knowledge of history of slavery and island archaeology and international commerce, et cetera, what would you say?
Can I say two things?
Sure.
Okay. The one, I think, is to do that kind of work, to start right from the ground up in places where there has been very little work. Cape Verde on land has had essentially one major project, which has now come to an end. Sao Tome and Principe has had zero. Annobon has had zero. That would be one thing, to really get things off the ground. But the other thing is to do it in a way that leaves behind some kind of viable archaeological heritage infrastructure In other words, something that is about building capacity within the country, rather than flying in a bunch of people from the West, letting them do their thing, and then letting them fly out again. Archaeology has done that plenty of times. It's moved on. So I would like to have the money not only to do the research, but also to build the capacity.
That's a good answer. And obviously the connections with Cape Verde and the United States are direct and numerous. One of our graduate students, in fact, did his PhD thesis on Cape Verdean culture, and he was of Cape Verdean descent, and went to study, Abby, what hip hop in Cape Verde, I think. So I'm glad, maybe we could talk about that offline, because I'd love to help facilitate that if I could. Abby, can we open this up,
Thank you very
please?
much.
Absolutely can. I have the happy task of being the curator of these questions. So people have been entering questions in here. So I will read them and hope that a dialogue can occur virtually between you and the questioner. I think this question, which Craig Stevens has put, I think it follows on what you were just saying about what you would want the legacy of new archaeological projects to be, at least how I'm understanding it. And he writes, the discipline of archaeology developed and was proliferated by similar colonial and extractive historical processes. If archaeology is a means of understanding the lasting yields of colonial processes, how will it first grapple with its inherently colonial and racist foundation? Is it possible with the current structure of the discipline for archaeology to contribute to restorative justice?
I hope that the answer to that is yes. I think that whichever side of the Atlantic we happen to be on, and the American experience is very different from that either in Africa or in the United Kingdom, but nevertheless, there are obviously, there are shared attributes. This is something that's very much come into everybody's consciousness this year in particular. I don't know what the situation at Harvard is, but certainly at my own university, it is very much something that we're aware of, not least because we have a large inheritance from a man called Cecil Rhodes. We have museums that are full of objects, some of which, as Suzanne will know very well, were removed from places like Nigeria non-consensually, to say the very least. I think we are very much aware as an institution, and I think as a discipline, of the importance of trying to be open to this, to acknowledge how things have developed, to try and find ways of making reparations. I'm not sure that's something we can do. You know, I mean, we can't make reparations for, we're not in a position where we can change what has happened in the past. What we can do is be aware of that, of what happened in the past, aware of where things have come from, and now think about, now, what are the inequalities that exist at the present time? And I think building capacity is one aspect of that. I think for Africanist archaeologists, one aspect of it is not simply talking to each other. If I would say one thing about my discipline, it would be that we're very good at talking to each other. We're not as good as we should be about publishing African archaeology more widely. We're not as good as we should be about putting African archaeology and the complexity and the vibrancy of Africa's past into mainstream archaeological narratives and mainstream archaeological debates. And that's really what I would like, you know, what I've been thinking about with islands to start to begin to do in a very small way. But I think it's something we need to do in a very much bigger way as well, because that's the way in which you begin to change the global narrative. That's the way you begin to change what is taught in schools and universities. That's the way in which you begin to change the frameworks that people operate under. There are many, many other things one could say, but I would say that as a small beginning by way of answering that particular question.
Well, I would think that that would include embedding your research into larger discourses about the transatlantic slave trade, African history, race relations, expanding ever more outward.
Yeah, absolutely.
And here's another question that might get to that idea of putting this into a larger discourse. And just from, I'm not at all a specialist in this field. This couldn't be farther from my own field. I think you're doing an excellent job of communicating to a broad audience here. So anyway, I'll just say that. But anyway, this other question, again, putting this into a larger context. You state that there was a collaboration between Africans and Europeans in the practice of slavery, but we don't generally hear about the African side of the story. It might be interesting to hear more facts about how that actually worked, and that what expanded the European, and that when expanded in the European and Western world, it became much more brutal. What are your thoughts with regard to the practice on the islands you've discussed of the African role in the slave trade?
I think what I was referring to there, in a sense, is what is clear on the say the coast of West Africa. Europeans, whatever their nationality, whether they were from Lithuania or France or Britain or the Netherlands or wherever, liked to dignify what they constructed as forts and castles. And sure, some of them are quite impressive monumentally. But at the end of the day, right the way up until the later part of the 1800s, those people were there on African sufferance. They weren't in a position to dictate very pointedly the terms of trade in anything. I think one of the observations that sticks in my mind always about this is the work of Ken Kelly from South Carolina when he was working at Ouida in Benin, and at Savi, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Ouida, a little bit inland from the modern coast. And he points out how in the late 1600s, early 1700s, the King of Ouida was very clear. He didn't care what the British and the French were getting up to in Europe or North America. As far as he was concerned, off his coast, they were going to mind their business, keep quiet, not fight one another, and obey his rules, which included living or having their merchants at his capital, living not in European style accommodation, but in African style accommodation under his close supervision. And if they weren't prepared to play by his rules, well, he wasn't prepared to trade. And I think you can see in the work of Krista Korse as an archaeologist at Elmina, you can see the work of Ibrahimo Chao at Gaure, or the work of people like George Brooks writing about the West African coast. The trade, whether it is in slaves or whether it is in anything else, is a commerce that involves both Africans and Europeans. It is not a European dominated venture in the way that Europeans might have wanted to portray themselves, or in the way that they're sometimes portrayed today. It's symbiotic is perhaps the wrong word, but it's something which is mutually constituted out of a whole series of European and African actors. And on the African islands specifically, again, to come back to Sao Tome and Principe, if I remember correctly, John Thornton has written how some of the early plantations, sugar plantations there, were actually owned by members of the elite of the West Central African Kingdom of Congo, which was a Portuguese ally. And that's a really interesting situation, that you have mainland Africans gaining financial economic benefit from the operation of sugar plantations on an offshore African island. Not something most people would think of. And if it's possible to find archaeological evidence of that, that would be fantastic.
You're absolutely right. The resistance to African agency in the slave trade is one of the most curious aspects of the history of the transatlantic slave trade to me. And it was infinitely more complex than this subject-object relation that we've been raised on, and why people are resistant to the African role in the slave trade is deeply puzzling to me. I mean, on the one hand, we can understand it politically and ideologically, but on the other hand, the evidence is so overwhelming and has been so long established that its resistance is discouraging sometimes. Really. You wonder what narrative is being satisfied by that reduction, that simplistic notion of the relationship of the institution. Abby?
Oh, thank you. I knew you would have something to say about that, Skip. So, and I'm glad you did. We have a couple more questions. One is a fairly specific one and one is a broad one. So I'll do the specific one first. At least to me, it seems more specific than the other. In terms of the spatial signature of control and enslavement as seen in the patterns of barrack architecture on some of the islands you referenced, do you see these spatial patterns continue over time? Are they reflected in more contemporary architecture as well? I guess the question is, what is the lingering architectural legacy of slavery on these islands?
I don't know that they would continue into anything near into the present at all. I'm sure that there are instances of architecture from the 18th, early 19th centuries in terms of plantation owners' houses that are now very much, cared for and considered to be an important aspect of the architectural heritage of places like Seychelles and Mauritius. But I'm not sure that as yet there's been enough archaeological work to really build a critical mass of observations that would allow you to see how, over a number of instances, the organization of space and the organization of architecture move through time, through the 1700s and into the 1800s and into the period following abolition. I think archaeological work on Réunion really only began 10 years ago. Archaeological work on Mauritius really is not very much older than that either. So there's an awful lot of work to go. Seychelles has had one investigation of a settlement that was a church-run settlement for people who were brought to the islands having been liberated by the Royal Navy off ships taking them to Zanzibar, and that is not yet published. So this is very much early days, but one would imagine that one would be able to begin to do this as more work is done and use the archives that exist, the historical archives along with that. And I think at that point, you're going to be able to get some really interesting questions of comparative interest between what you can see in the United States, what you can see in the Caribbean, and what you can see on African islands.
Yeah, I really enjoy the way you're talking about bringing all of these different archives into connection with, into conversation with one another. And this, I think we'll make this the final question, which is a kind of broad-based question and also is bringing together some things. This is from Tim Weiskell, who we know very well. This is what we have been waiting for as historians and anthropologists. It would be nice if this approach could begin to include consideration of period maps as well, since the development of the historical cartography is beginning to develop as well. So he asks, has Professor Mitchell worked with the historical cartographers in Africa? And he adds, historical cartography and archaeology would seem to form a naturally reinforcing alliance. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I haven't. It sounds like a damn good idea. And I think I'm going to think about that for the next several days. That's a really interesting suggestion. And again, I suspect there's probably been work done on the American side of the Atlantic in this respect. But I think that there would be some very interesting things there about the way in which places are being represented. the messages that are being conveyed or being intended by those representations. And I think that, you know, it will be interesting. It will be interesting to see whether the archaeological record would be supportive of that, or whether it might be capable of subverting some of that and giving a different take on things. So thank you very much for that point.
Peter, you should know that Tim is an Oxonian, has a PhD both in anthropology and in history, and is a lunatic on digital maps. He is the map maker's map maker. And we would love to connect you, if it's okay, if we can give Tim your email, and maybe you two can work together, perhaps even under the auspices of the Hutchins Center, since Tim is very much a part of our community, to pursue this idea, which just made me very excited. Abby, why do we have to stop? You're so mean. We were just getting started. The questions are so good.
We can keep going. I have to.
If you have more questions, I'm perfectly happy. Don't worry.
Okay.
I was just teasing, really, but if there is another good question,
I wonder if, and I'm going to ask Justin and Matt this, if Tim Weiskell had quite a few questions, and I think they're too long for me to extract from them. I'm wondering, would Justin, if you're there, would it be possible to bring Tim on if he's willing, and maybe he and Professor Mitchell could have a couple of questions and answers together?
Yeah, we can try to do that.
Okay,
Give me 1 second.
thank you. Tim, I hope.
Abby?
Yes?
That's a good idea. The danger is that we'll be on for 2 hours with Tim asking these
Well, we
questions.
can
So,
pull the plug, though. We can pull
all
it.
right, Tim.
It's just his question. I mean, I think based on your response, Professor Mitchell, to what he said, I think we would all benefit from maybe hearing a little conversation between the two of you. And as I said, I have a lot of text here from him. I think I'm not in a position to pull from that. So
Okay, well,
we're mixing up our format a little bit, keeping it interesting.
If Tim, there's Tim. Now, Tim,
yes,
you know me. I want an abbreviated question. I don't want one of these 5-page email questions.
okay.
All right.
Can you hear me at all?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, my friend.
Okay, well, the question I have is pretty simple. Island biogeography has been a big field. Skip and I studied it when we were at Yale together, and it was dominated by Pacific historians and biologists and ethnobotanists. I wondered if any of your work is related to the biogeography of the Pacific, and particularly the methodological work, because a lot of their work, especially by people like Jacques Barrault, looked at the migration of yams, for example, across the whole Pacific Island chains in one succession after another of migration. It would seem to me we could learn a lot as Africanists by drawing upon the geography that has been done, as you know, by the Groves. Richard Grove in particular wrote it from Cambridge, actually. You probably knew him then. He wrote an excellent book on Africa and the islands, which looked at to some extent, what was called the biogeography of these islands, and particularly looking at them as experiment places for the plantation biology of later experimentation. São Tomé is a great case. In the 16th century, the Portuguese experimented with cocoa on São Tomé. It wasn't adopted until the 19th century, really, basically until it was seen to be useful on the mainland in Ghana. But I mean, that history would be very interesting to delve into archaeologically.
Absolutely. I mean, I think biogeography is very much a part of, or island biogeography is very much a part of island archaeology. It has been a debated, controversial part of island archaeology because some people have felt that it is a way of assuming too environmentally determinist view of human history and not giving people enough agency. I think that if you throw the geography out, however, throw the biology out, it's a classic instance of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. As you say, you need to have that kind of contextual understanding of where people are living and what people are doing. I think that one of the projects that has been changing our understanding of some African islands over the last decade or so, that does draw some inspiration from work done in the Pacific, is the work by somebody called Nikki Boivin, a project which has gone by the name of the Sea Links Project. This has been looking at Indian Ocean connections, and it's involved work on a couple of places on the East African coast, but also on Pemba, on Madagascar, on the Comores. And that is one of the, some of the work that has come out of that is indeed some of the relatively limited amount of work on the archaeology of Africa's islands, which has explicitly interested itself in addressing questions of general, that is to say, not only African concern. So, for example, looking at things like geckos or other hitchhiking animals and their DNA as a way of trying to gain insights into the ways in which people may have been moving between places in the Indian Ocean world. Looking at what happens on Unguja, the main island of Zanzibar, when it becomes an island at the end of the last ice age, and how its mammalian fauna, which starts off with things like zebra and buffalo, gradually seems to whittle away as the island gets smaller and becomes completely surrounded by water. What are the particular challenges of living on a small island, environmentally, agriculturally, and so on, and why may that not be as sustainable as living on a bigger one? Those kinds of questions have been framed as part of the Sea Links project, and I think that's probably the way to go. And as I said, you know, it definitely is informed by experience in the Pacific, and in fact, people like Athol Anderson from New Zealand have had who's done a great deal of work on the settlement of many Pacific islands, has in fact had connections with Sea Links and working in the Indian Ocean, including Madagascar. So absolutely, we should engage in more.
Yeah, this is very encouraging because there's several different things you raised in your excellent presentation that we'd love to pursue, including all of the islands in the Atlantic, where questions of what might be called still megafauna, that is, you could say, when was the dog introduced, for example, to the Azores or to the Cape Verde Islands? The dog was very important, as it's actually portraited on the island of Gaure. One of the first Dutch images of the map of Gaure has a prominent dog presented. And you got to think about the power of the dog in coercing and controlling slave populations with a minimum amount of intervention by humans. In other words, if you had sort of junkyard dogs, which were quite fierce and bred in German Shepherd traditions, you know, you could control a massive number in a confined space, like a fort, with very few whites and a dog. Yeah. And it would seem to me that no one's really looked at the archaeology of dogs in those 80 castles on the Ghanaian coast, for example, let alone the ones in the offshore islands like Saint Tomé and in Gaure. But there's fantastic work you're doing, and let's get together because, yeah, the Oxford historian that Skip brought over to give the overview lecture for us last year, he's the Rhodes Professor of Race Relations. He gave a fantastic talk on Ibadan's tradition of historiography. It went over the heads of most of us who were there, but we've been taking notes ever since, in a sense. And it'd be great to provoke the Rhodes people. I was a Rhodes Scholar, so we could actually write a letter from within the house, as it were, to Rhodes House, to the current master or warden of Rhodes House. She's a Balliol fellow as well, and I was at Balliol, so we could gang up on her and say, well, why not have a little colloquium on why Rhodes should stand in some sense. I mean, there's a movement, as you know, Rhodes must fall within Oxford. There are few people who are saying, well, maybe his statue has to fall, but keep the papers. You know, we ought to keep the organization of, you know, studying the indirect as well as the direct impact of European colonialism, and the notion of moving from humans to macrofauna like dogs, and then to the microfauna. That is, if you look at the soil structures that change because of introduced crops, it's absolutely virginal. We haven't even begun to look at the impact on Africa's rhizosphere, if you want to call it that.
No,
But
that's
anything,
Tim,
so much. Thanks so much.
Tim, even the person writing the captions has quit the session. So we've never had that happen before. I didn't even know it was possible. She sent us a message saying, yeah, I don't know what you're all talking about. You're going on too long. I'll see you later. No, she didn't say that. She said she had another gig. But by my count, Abby, I think we've seen the birth of 2 or 3 projects.
I was going to say we just launched a few dissertations there, I think.
Yeah, I think this is great. Suzanne, my dear friend, thank you for a splendid introduction. Abby, thank you for being the gracious host that you are each week, and Peter especially. Yeah. Thank you. I used the word riveting. I did that intentionally. I was riveted from top to bottom, and we have a lot more to discuss. This is one time each week. I regret the fact that we can't continue at Benedetto's restaurant over several lovely bottles of wine, but never more so than today, because you raised issues dear to my heart, though you had no way of knowing, and you had no way of knowing that you were going to meet Tim Weiskell, who I think will be a friend of yours for a long time. So on behalf of my colleagues at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research and the Department of African and African American Studies and the Department of Anthropology, Archaeology, and the History of Art. Anything I left out, Suzanne? We would like to thank you for what we say in our tradition is showing up. Not only were you here, but you delivered a very thoughtful, very provocative lecture. We look forward to the book, which we hope you and Harvard University Press will allow to come out. And it's just been such a pleasure. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.